War. War never changes. The Romans waged war to gather slaves and wealth. Spain built an empire from its lust for gold and territory. Hitler shaped a battered Germany into an economic superpower. But war never changes.
In the 21st century, the Fallout game series has become one of the most famous, successful, and iconic in the world. Fans still enjoy playing Fallout 4 today. Remember with sadness the wonderful New Vegas and the sequel that didn't happen. And don't miss the opportunity to throw a couple of affectionate words at Fallout 76 and Bethesda, who didn't give a damn on the merits of the franchise and ruined all the efforts of the developers of the very first original game in the series. Or not. Meanwhile, does anyone know how the iconic first Fallout was created? Who was behind this? Where did the idea come from? And who is the Dragonplay team anyway? We want to talk about all this in our first video series, dedicated to the ups and downs of the legendary Fallout. Considering the series released in 2024, which gave the franchise a second youth, it would be wrong not to talk about its roots. So make yourself comfortable in front of your Pip-Boy's screen. You're watching PressX, so let's get started. Of course, everyone is well aware of the phrase that has become iconic in the Fallout series: war never changes. But few people know where exactly the Fallout story began, and it didn't start with a phrase, or even by a happy accident. Here, we need to tell a story about the company, or rather about specific people who became the developers, authors, and ideological leaders of the Fallout game series. Therefore, we will begin our story a little from afar. It was 1994. The world of computer games was at its peak. The emergence of new studios, the development of genres, the introduction of new technologies into projects, and the eternal pursuit of unattainable ambitious goals of talented developers. One of these talented developers was young programmer Tim Kaine, who had a master's degree in computer science from the University of California, Irvine, and had been a staff employee at Interplay Entertainment for several years. Nowadays, Tim Kaine is a game development legend and the author of such notable role-playing games as Arcanum and Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines, the man who had a hand in creating the popular Pillars of Eternity and South Park: The Stick of Truth, as well as the author of the successful The Outer Worlds. However, Kaine began working in the RPG genre in 1994 as Interplay was developing computer role-playing games. The genre focused on medieval fantasy, with elves and dwarves, swords, magic, and dragons. The public was eagerly awaiting the new part of Eye of the Beholder, and the actively developing Baldur's Gate. Of course, Interplay did not have such high-profile titles in its portfolio, but it made a name for itself in this genre, with the series of games The Bard's Tale and the fantasy RPG Dragon Wars. Interplay had the rights to create games based on the Dungeons & Dragons universe and did not want them to sit idle. Therefore, at the time of 1994, Interplay already had several projects in development. Tim Kaine looked at all this with boredom and decided to try to develop his own game engine. Over time, the idea of a potential project based on it arose in the developer's head. And for the next few months, he was the only employee working on the new game. And since Tim was just a programmer, he couldn't come up with a plot, visuals, or put together a full-fledged concept for the game on his own. Therefore, Tim soon began secretly inviting colleagues with whom he worked in the company to join his project.
It was delicious. And I started, I think the first time I actually tried to get people is, I wasn't allowed to actually ask anyone to work on my team. So what I'd do is I'd send out an email saying, at 6 p.m. in this conference room, I will be sitting with a pizza. And I really thought a lot of people would show up. And I think, maybe 8 people showed up?
It was more like 6 or 7.
It was you.
I don't know. I don't think you put me on those emails.
No, it was company-wide. Because one time Fargo responded, he goes, hey, I've got that conference room reserved for poker at 8. So whatever you're doing in there, you're going to be out by 8. I'm like, we'll be out by 8.
Interplay's management found out about this and was extremely unhappy that the company's employees were not working on already planned games in the Dungeons & Dragons universe, but were wasting their working time on some nonsense. Management immediately gave the order to disperse the loafers to their departments and force them to work on what was needed. However, Tim Kaine managed to talk to his superiors, the founder of Interplay, Brian Fargo, and convince him of the prospects of this development because the game was planned in a post-apocalyptic setting. Interplay believed that there was no way they could sell this game to people. However, Brian Fargo listened to Tim's arguments and allowed the creation of his project to continue. In fact, he went against the Interplay board of directors, but he had his own views on what was happening. After all, in a sea of similar fantasy RPGs, Interplay's rather notable game was Wasteland, which took place in a world after a nuclear war. It was this idea that Brian Fargo advised the team to stick to. Soon, the project developed a concept with its own setting and its own role-playing system, created on Tim Kaine's isometric game engine. The programmer himself took on the role of future games producer, and Brian not only gave the go-ahead for its development, he came up with the name for the game, Fallout. Perhaps, from this moment, the development of the first post-apocalyptic role-playing game in the Fallout series began. Having released the RPG Wasteland in 1988, Interplay Entertainment did not make any technological breakthrough and did not gain much popularity, but the game was remarkable. Under the terms of a previously concluded agreement with the publisher, Electronic Arts, all rights to Interplay's intellectual property were assigned to the publisher, and the company could not arbitrarily create a full-fledged sequel to Wasteland. However, now, thanks to the efforts of Tim Kaine, Interplay was able to begin development of a new post-nuclear game in 1994. Until 1996, Kaine independently developed a draft version of the engine, interface, and first design documents. The project was called Vault 13, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure, which was later shortened to a short version, Vault 13. It became the spiritual successor to Wasteland, released in 1988. The name came from the game engine that Tim worked on. It was based on the role-playing system GURPS, Generic Universal Role-Playing System, developed in 1986 by Steve Jackson, and his company of the same name, Steve Jackson Games. You may know it from the popular board game Munchkin.
I know Munchkin pretty well, cause I wrote it. Okay, time to open a door.
GURPS itself relies on character points as the main element of character creation, as well as a 3-6 scoring system, rolling 3 6-sided dice. The player spends points on attributes, choosing his advantages and disadvantages, and acquiring skill levels. A character has only 4 main attributes: strength, agility, intelligence, and health. Taking this role-playing system as a basis, Tim created the first prototype of his game, and in 1996, the work changed its course and went into full swing. They created a division called Dragonplay within Interplay, which developed exclusively role-playing games. Tim Kaine received a small team at his disposal to implement the planned project, and by the middle of the year, the Vault 13 project was renamed Fallout. To this day, there is no reliably accurate answer as to what exactly this was connected with. The only thing that is known is that Interplay has some copyright problems due to the original project name. But the problems were just beginning, and the name change was only the least of them.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
Soon, on May 13th, 1996, Interplay presented the game with a new name at E3, where any visitor could play a short demo version compiled by Tim. Steve Jackson Games, which owned the rights to the game's role-playing system, reviewed the new GURPS materials in Fallout, and was pleased with the current progress of development. They were surprised by how close the computer version of the game can be to the tabletop GURPS. They also separately noted Interplay's meticulousness in relation to some minor system details. The team working on the game grew to 30 people. Some of them worked on the Fallout project even before it officially entered the development stage. For example, Leonard Boyarsky, whom you may know as one of the key designers of Fallout and even Diablo 3. He initially worked for Interplay as a freelancer, but by 1995, after a couple of successful projects, he was hired as an art director, lead artist, and narrative designer. His first work as lead artist was the role-playing dungeon crawler Stonekeep. Well, you can guess where this is going. Yes, he is another developer who loves D&D. While working on Stonekeep, Leonard met Jason D. Anderson, who worked as a cleanup artist and was also a D&D fan. Jason actually started playing Dungeons & Dragons when he was about 10 years old, and so somehow their communication began to swirl and swirl, that one day after work, Leonard, Jason, and Tim, all three of them, went to play Dungeons & Dragons. I wonder if there is at least one popular game franchise whose authors are not geeky D&D fans who once got together just to have a good time. The question is rhetorical, since Dungeons & Dragons is perhaps the best way to develop imagination, creative thinking, and learn how to create stories. Many developers in the field of computer games have played D&D at least once in their lives. So, where were we? Anderson, Boyarsky, and Kane played Dungeons & Dragons and GURPS from time to time. Until one day, Kane sent out an email to his colleagues asking them to meet after work for pizza to discuss creating a video game based on the engine he had created. That's how the guys got into the team that created Fallout. Boyarsky insisted on a post-apocalyptic setting for the game, as he considered the market to be overcrowded with fantasy role-playing games. Plus, he and Anderson were big fans of Mad Max 2. This film had a particular influence on the future game.
Ever seen a man beat the snake before? Do I?
Initially, the team worked on in-game materials with Scott Campbell, who managed to work on Ultima Wine, Doom, and The Lost Vikings, before starting work on Stonekeep. And then he ended up on Tim Kane's team and became one of the first ideological creators of the future Fallout. Soon, at a party, he met Brian Friermuth, who had been passionate about writing almost all his life, but had never published his work. Scott became very friendly with Brian and invited him to work, and Brian agreed. It so happened that they both liked Wasteland, which was a key reference point for the future game. However, most people still believe that Scott was the main creator of the Fallout world. In fact, they developed ideas together about what life could be like, in a post-apocalypse style. Ultimately, Brian developed the topic so much that he even wrote stories about it. As a result, Scott Campbell and Brian Friermuth wrote all of the game's documentation, in-game, dialogue, design documents, etc. And the young programmer, Jesse Reynolds, who really liked science fiction, exciting fantasy novels, and also role-playing games that could be played with only paper and pencils at hand, was responsible for the programming component and writing the game code. Perhaps it was these interests, as well as an interest in programming, that brought Jesse into the gaming industry. Or rather, the team that worked on Stonekeep. Has anyone even played Stonekeep? Did it even come out? Considering how many of its creators took time off work for Tim Kane's project. Actually, these people were the backbone of the team that took on the creation of the future Fallout, the backbone of the Dragonplay division. Somehow after evening gatherings, the company consisting of Tim, Scott, Brian, Leonard, Jesse, and Jason agreed that the game genre would be nuclear post-apocalypse. After the ideas of time travel, alien invasion, and horror were discarded, the main ideologists in the person of Scott and Brian decided to concentrate around the plot of Wasteland. Together with Brian, Scott created the original version of the future world history of Fallout. One night, Tim Kane had a dream in which people lived underground in huge concrete bunkers the size of entire cities. On the surface, above the bunkers, everything imaginable was happening. No one knew what was really going on there, and therefore people were afraid to go to the surface. It was this dream that the team turned into the game setting, where one of the inhabitants of the bunker had to get to the surface to save his people. The team considered making the game in first person in 3D, but abandoned the idea because the graphical models would have been poorly detailed. Instead, the developers chose an oblique projection, creating a trimetric projection. The game was supposed to have an open world and a non-linear plot. In fact, it was a continuation, Wasteland 2. And in this regard, many elements of the original game were borrowed or transformed, an organization similar to the Guards of the Old Order, which would later become the Brotherhood of Steel, the leader who eventually became the Master, and so on. Scott also offered the ideas of the Raiders, a worldwide post-apocalyptic currency in the form of bottle caps, the man-made evolution virus, the Vault experiment, the Salanters, super mutants, and the Wolverine bears that later became Deathclaws, though not everything offered made it to release. At the same time, Brian, not without Scott's participation, came up with the first quests and characters for many locations, such as Necropolis, Shady Sands, Boneyard, Glow, Hub, and he wrote about 80% of the text for the game's main characters, who were to become talking heads. The first plots, characters, and locations were ready long before the completion of other developments on Fallout. Anderson's involvement in the game began with Kane providing drawings to test the graphics engine he was creating. Even though Anderson was hired as an artist, he was allowed to take on multiple roles during the development process. He attended all the design meetings and eventually developed a way to implement the intended graphics in the Fallout game engine. In general, the development process was greatly influenced by the team's small size. The limited number of employees contributed to the variety of tasks they took on. As a result, Anderson created most of the game's opening cinematic and modeled and animated half of the creatures, including female humans and mutants. He also developed the interface, created many landscape tiles and wall sets. After all, he did a lot of the design work regarding the story and quests. Even Anderson's wife contributed to the game's development, creating the death screen and several animations, including the two-headed Brahmin and Mr. Handy, and in-game cutscenes. One of Anderson's fondest memories of developing Fallout was co-creating the game's various endings with Leonard Boyarsky. There were quite a few of them, including a rather controversial one, in which the main character was rejected by his own people, which corresponded to the tone of the game, because the characters of the Vault's inhabitants were quite xenophobic. Kane was initially skeptical about this ending, but considering that other role-playing games cannot offer this to the player, but rather do everything possible to turn the game character into a hero, Tim Kaine agreed to add such an ending to the game. To balance the progression of Fallout, the developers made side quests optional, but if the characters did not gain experience and improve their skills through side quests, they were too ill-prepared for the game ending. And game designer Chris Taylor added a 150-day time limit to the game, which limited the player in his quest to complete all existing quests, and required him to focus on the main ones.
Won't help you here. Prepare to die, you sniveling little... Whoa! What is this? Where did you get that armor from? Why is your sword on fire? What are those orbs?
Oh, I've just been doing like lots of side quests, kind of finding some cool loot, leveling up.
Quests in Fallout were given moral ambiguity, with no clear right or wrong decisions. Thus, the player could choose any option that suited him best and get a unique story development. As a result, at the beginning of 1997, the game was almost at the final stage of development. On January 13th, Steve Jackson Games, which owned the rights to the game role-playing system, shared the announcement of Fallout on its website as a report on the progress of the project's development and announced its release in April 1997. Steve Jackson Games was even the first to receive an alpha version of the game for internal study and in case of possible tips for improving gameplay. However, instead, the company soon broke off their cooperation. Now the team was in for real problems. Interplay, and in particular the Dragonplay division that developed the Fallout project, lost the rights to use the GURPS system. What caused this remains a mystery to this day. Fergus Urquhart, one of the key developers of the Dragonplay division, believed that the reason for the breakup was Interplay's attempt to avoid bureaucratic delays and legal disputes surrounding game content. For example, the image of Vault Boy, the modest scale of the characters, or the game cruelty. As in the introduction of Fallout, American soldiers shot a Canadian prisoner of war. In turn, Scott Campbell stated that Steve Jackson Games was satisfied with almost everything, except for the images of Vault Boy on the screen of the character's characteristics and the brutal scene in the game intro. According to him, because of this alone, the game would most likely have to be remade in order to retain the rights to the license. Sean Punch, GURPS editor at Steve Jackson Games, analyzed the situation this way. It's unlikely that a single cutscene, loading screen, or line of dialogue could cause such significant controversy. The reason for the breakup was that the licensing agreement did not clearly outline the content approval process in a way that satisfied each party. It turned out to be easier to remake the role-playing system than to rewrite the license agreement with all the accompanying legal disputes. A month later, Steve Jackson himself was outraged by what had happened, saying that he would like to know the reasons why Interplay decided to abandon the license, since there were no official statements from them. Nevertheless, regardless of the real reasons, Interplay believed that the breakup occurred by mutual consent of the parties. At the same time, this turn of events took the Fallout team by surprise. In addition, due to the resounding success of the role-playing video game Diablo, which was released in January, studio management began to put pressure on Kane's team to turn the Fallout game in development into a real-time multiplayer game. Tim Kaine did not succumb to management pressure and maintained the game concept. The development of a post-apocalyptic project was up in the air. The unjustified termination of the licensing agreement after 3 years of cooperation soured the relationship between Interplay and Steve Jackson. Tim Kaine advocated for the project's complete preservation and the use of GURPS developments, but no one was interested in his opinion. The decision was made by the bosses of Interplay. On March 14th, 1997, Steve Jackson was notified in a phone conversation that GURPS would no longer be used, and all developments would be removed from the project or replaced. As a result, Kaine and the team of programmers had to create from scratch and implement their own role-playing system into a game in just a couple of weeks, which had been in development for 2 years. The changes affected not only the game, but also the development team itself. Lead designer Scott Campbell left the project, leaving behind many design documents related to the story, locations, and characters, as well as scripts and creative developments for Fallout. Of course, Campbell's contribution to the project is invaluable, but after his departure from Interplay, Chris Taylor replaced him on Tim Kaine's team. At first, Chris worked on finalizing the demo version of the game, after which he switched to the main part. He was involved in monitoring the work progress on the project and, if necessary, made adjustments to the plot, dialogues, mechanics of interaction with game content, and also redesigned locations. While serving as lead designer, Taylor had subordinate designers David Hendy and Scott Everts. Scott Benny joined them late in development, and Chris needed an eye on everyone.
Need to find another place to put your chewing gum besides the underside of your desk, Mr. Finnegan!
Oh, no way. The old codger can see at the back of his head.
Moreover, in addition to the designers, Chris to some extent controlled the programmers and artists, whom he gave tasks to create appropriate content. Although he wrote and designed the Vault Dweller Survival Guide and helped summarize the designer's intentions for the Fallout development, everything else was done by the team under his strict supervision. When selecting weapons, which Chris approached with great care, he tried to allow the least realistic weapons into the game, but at the same time they had to be stylish. For example, to create a .223 pistol, Chris asked Interplay artist Gary Plattner to create a proper image for it, and instructed programmers to make such a weapon work correctly in combat conditions. Another of these notable tasks was the city of Junktown, which, from a very modest description in the original design document, has grown into a fairly developed settlement. Or for example, the original design of the Mr. Handy brand robot was also invented by Chris. Later, the artist simply took his drawing as a basis and improved it. By the fall of 1997, the game was finally ready. Boyarsky ended his work as art director on Fallout by establishing a recognizable 1950s future graphic style, humorous Vault Boy trait maps, and slightly refining the game's dialogue. In addition, it was he who came up with an unusual game ending. An obvious feature of Fallout was its cruelty. The game showed in every way what the civilized world could turn into in the event of a nuclear war. That man is a beast by nature, and that even in situations that call into question the life of all humanity, absolute evil can exist in the form of human selfishness and thirst for power. This is exactly the kind of game that society saw on October 10th, 1997. What was the game really about? Considering all the game variety and variability in the endings of Fallout, the answer may lie a little deeper than it seems to the naked eye. Let's figure it out. The history of the Fallout world begins not in the future, but long before the present day. About 7,500 years BC, the Ubarian civilization lived on planet Earth in the city of Ubar. It was an ancient but very advanced race, which became extinct due to technological progress. The exact reasons for this are unknown. However, after 4,000 years, the first people appeared on Earth. And many centuries later, in 1894, an archaeologist named Lorenzo Cabot attempted to find some ruins or evidence of the lost city of Ubar. Lorenzo and a colleague named Metternich set out on a secret expedition to Asia, to the Rub al-Khali, Arbi al-Khali, seeking to excavate the lost city. As a result of long work, their team stumbled upon a large, underground complex containing a bunch of ancient artifacts. According to Lorenzo, this complex was the Great Temple of Ubar. However, our today's story is not about this. Humanity on Earth developed according to the well-known scenario until the mid-20th century. After the end of World War II, society chose a development path slightly different from today's. Having shown the world the wonders of nuclear physics and splitting the atomic nucleus in the 50s, humanity resorted to using it in nuclear reactors. This allowed people to generate enormous amounts of energy, and the world was filled with nuclear power plants, which became the main source of power. At first glance, in our history, everything was like this. Well, except for Ubarian. However, if in real life, humanity was afraid of the destructive power of the atomic bomb, first used at the end of the Second World War, then in the world of Fallout, it wasn't. Instead of developing transistors, microchips, and other innovative technologies, people in the Fallout world focused on developing vacuum devices using nuclear technology. This is how cars and entire cities appeared that ran exclusively on nuclear energy. In just 10 years, they formed the architectural and socio-cultural appearance of American society, dependent on the atom, even at home. Even the conventional coffee machine in the kitchen ran on nuclear energy. And despite the transience of time and the technological development, the visual appearance of technology and architecture has remained the same. Transistors were also used in technology, but much less frequently. For example, in televisions and computers that were tube-based. And when science came to artificial intelligence, smartwatches and smartphones, they were also tube-based. Thus, the world quietly plunged into the retrofuturism of the 50s. In the 60s, America was the first to send a man into space and also took a political course towards a commonwealth of society. In fact, communism, now the United States of America, did not consist of 50 separate states, but a union of these states into 13 commonwealths. The symbol of this political reform was the country's new flag, which contained only 13 white stars instead of 50. The Cold War between the USA and the USSR dragged on slightly, and the rulers of the states basically decided not to end it. After all, nuclear weapons appeared not only in the United States, but also in their adversary. Consequently, the country could be attacked at any time, and you had to be always prepared to attack the enemy first. The Soviet Union was able to overcome the crisis of the 90s, and did not collapse, but only became stronger and stronger. Because of this, the Cold War continued for many decades. Moreover, when a third participant, the Communist People's Republic of China, joined the arms race at the beginning of the 21st century, the conflict only intensified. It was China that became the main threat to the United States of America. By 2037, thanks to the development of nuclear technology, humanity made a breakthrough in the field of robotics, and soon the first model of an assistant robot from General Atomics International entered the market. It was called Mr. Handy, and soon became quite popular. Gradually, private companies, the army and intelligence agencies began to use them. And then people started using Mr. Handy for home purposes. To move, Mr. Handy used a jet engine and had several manipulators and tracking sensors with a view range of more than 270 degrees. The robot's main function was housekeeping, such as cooking or walking the dog. At the same time, Mr. Handy could defend both itself and the owner's house, and later models were equipped with a circular saw and a flamethrower. Over time, the success of this model gave impetus to the development of robotics and led to the new company emergence on the market, Robco Industries. It was founded in 2042 by entrepreneur and technologist Robert Edwin House, who would later play a significant role in the post-apocalyptic game world. Over the next 10 years, the company developed and released other innovative robot models. In general, it is worth understanding that American society was literally immersed in nuclear topics, and therefore, even on televisions and radios, which were mass-produced by the Radiation King Company, they broadcast shows on this topic. Instead of the familiar Pepsi or Coke, on every corner one could find a Nuka-Cola machine. Both adults and children enjoyed it. And for energy drink lovers, the manufacturer of Nuka-Cola had released a quantum version of the drink with the strontium-90 isotope, which gave the cola a bright blue glow. I think there is no need to explain that in fact, strontium-90 is a chemical element with potential toxicity that is formed as a result of nuclear explosions and accidents at nuclear power plants. And in everyday life, it is used in the production of batteries and pyrotechnics. In a word, delicious. Nevertheless, over a couple of decades of such human development and a constant increase in production, the planet's energy resources have been depleted. Serious preconditions for an energy crisis began, and therefore a natural war for resources soon broke out. However, the USA initially managed to avoid a crisis by sending troops to Mexico in 2051. Under pressure from the Mexican government, the US managed to import their oil. But a real war began in Europe. The countries of the Middle East raised energy prices, and the European Union was forced to send troops to Arab countries. This began a 10-year war between Europe and the Middle East for oil control, and oil prices skyrocketed, literally destroying the economies of individual countries of the European Union. Then, the war for resources began within the Union. And in 2052, the local United Nations, which was trying to end the conflict, disintegrated. Humanity began to panicky search for alternative energy sources and transfer its cars to nuclear batteries. But people could not do without oil. And while the armies of the EU, the Near and Middle East were killing each other for black gold, America and China were quietly taking a closer look at what was happening and thinking about how to survive if the war affected them. Therefore, soon the United States of America began to build underground shelters throughout the country in case of nuclear bombings. The shelter network project was called Safe House, and the construction tender was won by Vault Tech. Vault Tech management convinced the US government that these shelters would help save part of the country's population, so that after the war ended, the survivors could begin to restore the population, and then America itself. The leaders planned to take refuge on a spaceship. We'll tell you why they wouldn't want to go underground a little later. This continued until 2053, when suddenly an epidemic of an unknown deadly virus broke out in the United States. Spread by airborne droplets, it spread throughout the country. People called this virus New Plague. And the authorities were forced to introduce national quarantine and isolation. Nobody knows where the disease came from. What is known is that the American government was developing biological weapons, codenamed Limit 115, for a more humane war with China without the use of atomic bombs. We encourage you to add 2 + 2 yourself. Yes, China sent spies to the United States and they managed to steal test tubes with experimental biological weapons, but they failed to escape. The spies were discovered and eliminated, and the test tubes with Limit 115 broke, and the virus began to mow down innocent people. At the end of 1953, the situation in the Middle East deteriorated greatly. One of the largest cities in Israel, Tel Aviv, was destroyed by terrorists who seized nuclear weapons. In this regard, Arab countries were forced to launch nuclear strikes on European countries, and those on them in response. China, meanwhile, began developing its own biological weapons. Having learned about this, the United States decided that they did not need a second plague and, as a means of protection, began developing a miraculous vaccine for all diseases. The development contract was given to the research corporation West Tech. Under the influence of this vaccine, a person was becoming healthier, stronger, more resilient, and gained immunity to almost any disease. And besides, a person received conditional immortality, well, until some ill-wisher with a pistol intervened in their life. In addition, there were a couple of side effects from this virus. A person could become slightly dull, outwardly turn into a pumped-up green mutant, and with 100% probability, become infertile. Later, in 2075, West Tech would begin to study these mutagenic properties, and thus will soon invent the Forced Evolutionary Virus, abbreviated FEV. West Tech wanted to use the development to create an army of super soldiers, but more on that later. By the end of the 50s, people had plasma and laser weapons, thanks to the development of technology, and most importantly, humanity has made another technological revolution, creating the world's first full-fledged artificial intelligence. All this made it possible to increase the army efficiency. It was only by 2060 that the wars stopped. Oil in the Middle East had finally run out, and therefore there was no longer any point in fighting for it or wasting arms reserves. War was over. The European Union and the Middle East fell into complete decline, losing any political influence. The EU had collapsed and was mired in civil wars. Nobody remembered the Soviet Union and had no idea what was going on with it. Apparently, complete isolation. Thus, in the struggle for a bright future, the main participants among those remaining were the United States and China. And since the last drops of oil were owned by America, China decided to declare war on the United States. In the mid-60s, the real fun began in America. And no, we are not talking about the invasion of stoned hippies. The owner of the Robco company, Robert House, carried out mathematical calculations and concluded that the apocalypse was definitely about to happen in the next 15 years. Then he connected his brain to a supercomputer in his Lucky 38 hotel in Las Vegas and got rid of a biological vessel that was no longer needed, the human body. Well, to protect the computer, House provided a powerful missile defense and an army of Protectron robots released by Robco. But that's not all the fun that awaited America. The fuel and energy crisis prompted the United States to look for new sources of energy. So in 2066, scientists developed thermonuclear batteries. And the West Tech company received a contract to develop an exoskeleton for soldiers, which could just be powered by a thermonuclear battery. This exoskeleton, popularly called power armor, has become the only alternative for the army to large military equipment, such as tanks. Meanwhile, the Chinese army landed in Alaska and began to militarily take away its main oil fields from the United States. American troops were driven back from Alaska, and the United States had to replace its losses with Canadian resources. By and large, Canada was annexed altogether, and China was able to organize the transportation of American oil to its homeland and thereby stabilized its economy. Sometime later, the American military landed in China and Alaska, revealing to the enemy its superweapon, the giant autonomous robot Liberty Prime. It was developed to liberate Anchorage, Kurds, captured by China in Alaska. But Liberty Prime turned out to be incapable of combat due to the lack of a normal power source. Power armor came to the aid of the Americans. With the help of the T-45 and the improved T-51, the United States regained control of Alaska and was able to advance deeper into China. In addition, in 2076, the developments of the West Tech company allowed the US government to begin testing the forced evolutionary virus on people. To do this, the virus was released into the water supply of the small city of Huntersville. As a result, the entire city of residents turned into super mutants, aggressive, green, and very strong. Later, the authorities eliminated them and moved their research to California, where they also tried to crossbreed animals for military purposes. But instead, they accidentally created uncontrollable, creepy, and dangerous creatures which they called death claws. Nevertheless, the US war with China continued until October 23, 2077. On this day, China's defending and cornered forces were forced to launch a nuclear attack on America with everything remaining in their arsenal. The United States government was launching a similar nuclear response against China, and the Soviet Union and other countries with nuclear weapons joined the celebration and created a real hell on Earth called the Great War. In fact, today versions of the root causes of the onset of the apocalypse vary. There are still various theories about who struck first and why. And the 2024 series, Fallout, showed a completely different version, according to which Vault-Tec themselves wanted to carry out a targeted strike in order to more actively sell shelters. But someone got ahead of them. Nonetheless, in reality, just a couple of hours after the nuclear strikes, the surface is covered with radioactive ash, and the whole world falls silent. From this moment, the main events of the first part of the Fallout series begin, although we are still far from the very beginning of the game. The walls of underground shelters actually withstood nuclear attacks, and saved quite a lot of people, including the doctor of Vault 8, Richard Moreau. Moreau was one of those brave souls who were the first to come to the surface after the day of sealing the shelters. The group he led was organized to collect information from external environmental monitoring devices. But in the process of collecting information, there was an incident that has still been shrouded in mystery to this day. One person from the detachment died, and Richard Moreau disappeared without a trace. It's unclear who or what killed the group member, or where Richard disappeared to. What's known is that a year later, Richard returned to Vault 8, but by vote, Moreau was expelled from the shelter for alleged murder. He was forced to remain on the surface, and therefore decided to change his name to Richard Gray. At the same time, it turned out that, unfortunately, the Shelter Project turned out to be a large-scale and vile experiment on humanity, conducted by the secret organization, Enclave. This organization included the most influential people in the country, and thus represented a shadow government dictating its own rules of the game. And in preparation for a nuclear apocalypse, an influential group of people began building a spaceship, which they plan to house, exclusively, the best of the best representatives of humanity. These people were planned to be sent in search of their new home in space. In simple words, the colonization of new planets. And since it was difficult to predict the effect of confined space and endless space on the best of the best, Enclave decided to use the future underground shelter system as a platform for experiments on people. This would allow them to better understand how human behavior changes over a long period of time, and what changes need to be made to the spacecraft. For example, in Vault 69, it was decided to accommodate 999 women and only one man. They wanted to place one person and a whole box of dolls in Vault 77 to see how loneliness would affect the test subject. In Vault 21, any conflicts had to be resolved exclusively by gambling, like poker. Vault 92 conducted a study on the effects of white noise on people with an ear for music. And only children would be allowed into Vault 29. We can go on and on with similar examples.
Stay out of level 12. Obviously, we'd prefer you not go there. Oh, and we only have one foosball table, so if you want to play, you gotta sign up.
Only 17 shelters among all were without local jokes and experiments. They were Control 1s for comparison with people from other shelters. And besides, these 17 shelters had the goal of truly preserving the human population. The technologies possessed by the shelter residents were truly amazing. For example, each shelter was equipped with a Garden of Eden creation kit, abbreviated GECK. It was developed by the Vault-Tec company to revitalize poisoned radioactive soil into soil suitable for gardening. Also, the same Vault-Tec, together with the Robco company, developed a portable computer called Pip-Boy. This device was supposed to help shelter residents monitor their vital signs, facilitate communication, store and transmit information to other devices, and so on. In short, an iPhone from the world of Fallout, Tim Cook would be jealous.
This is iPhone 7. It's the best iPhone that we have ever created.
By the way, the forced evolutionary virus, developed by scientists, was kept and experimented on within the walls of the Mariposa military base in the years before the apocalypse. The military base was not damaged by the nuclear attack, so the people on it were able to survive the first hours of the apocalypse. 2 days later, the radiation level dropped to acceptable levels. Then, the military buried those killed by radiation, sealed the base, and, taking everything they needed to survive in the wasteland, went to the government bunker in Lost Hills. There, they founded the Brotherhood of Steel, a paramilitary technocratic organization whose main task was the search and preservation of technology. The Earth's surface had undergone global changes as a result of a nuclear war. Now the flora and fauna of the planet looked a little different. Most of the plants and animals died out, and the part that remained under the influence mutated from radiation. Thus, the Earth's surface was covered with wastelands inhabited by giant rad cockroaches and scorpions, mutant bears, yaoguai, two-headed cows, Brahmins, and others. The people who remained on the surface during the apocalypse were also exposed to radiation and mutated into the so-called ghouls. Due to huge doses of radiation and tissue necrosis, they lost their previous appearance, completely lost adipose tissue, and almost completely skeletal muscles. Sometimes ghouls could be wild, losing their brain function, but they could also be quite intelligent. And besides, having mutated into a ghoul, a person becomes almost immune to radiation and aging. Ghouls live for a very long time, hundreds of years, or even more. Due to the complete loss of communication within the country, the states were divided into two conventional parts, West and East. Most of the cities were destroyed, but Las Vegas, with its air defense system, survived, although not all of it. Also among the partially preserved cities were Los Angeles, which was then called the Boneyard, and a small settlement in Southern California, Junktown. The hub, one of the largest trading cities in Fallout, became a transshipment point between them. Over time, the town of Shady Sands, founded by a farming community, would also appear on the surface, but more on that later. Let's return to Dr. Gray. Wandering the wastelands, Richard Gray reached the hub, where he joined a community of traders and, as a doctor, began providing medical services to local residents. He did this for 11 years, until the local merchant boss, Harold, decided to find and destroy the habitat of mutants who were always attacking the hub caravans. Harold was interested in the opinions of scientists and doctors at the hub about the abilities of mutants, and therefore Richard Gray seemed very useful to him, a doctor, philosopher, and generally the smartest person. Therefore, on May 22, 2102, Harold hired Richard to join his squad. That same day, the squad went northwest of the hub in search of the mutants' lair. This lair turned out to be the Mariposa military base, where various experiments on animals and people were carried out for a long time. At that moment, the place was infested with mutants, and Harold's squad was attacked. Only 4 survived, including Richard. They decided to go inside and explore the base, but in doing so, they triggered the security system. They started the protracted battle with the robots, as a result of which only Harold and Richard Gray reached the laboratory where the vats with forced evolutionary virus were located. Near the vats with FEV, the researchers were attacked by a robot crane. Harold was thrown out of the base, but Gray suffered more severely. The robot threw Richard straight into a vat of FEV, and he became horribly mutated. However, thanks to the properties of the virus, Gray survived. Experiencing terrible pain and sometimes losing consciousness for several days, the doctor was able to climb out of the vat, and despite the clouding of his mind, he managed to crawl to the control room. It took Gray a month. In addition, during the mutations, Richard's intelligence developed even more, so the doctor soon managed to hack into the computer at the Mariposa base. Richard began making audio recordings on it, which he wanted to leave there for future generations. And gradually, Gray felt better. He gradually began to come to his senses, recognizing himself as a green-skinned mutant with peeling skin. Richard became one of the rare lucky ones whose mind was not damaged when interacting with FEV, but, on the contrary, received unlimited possibilities. He felt that he could understand even the most complex philosophical questions. Reflecting on what happened to him and his expedition, Richard decided that all the other members of his group were dead, and that he had to learn more about his abilities and the phenomena that were observed when diving into vats of FEV. Then Gray began to catch various creatures on Mariposa and place them in vats with the virus, where they spent the same amount of time as he spent. At the end of the experiments, he noted that the mutants turned out stronger and more conscious. And yet, due to hunger, Richard was forced to eat all these creatures, while feeling their consciousness and trying to learn something new. In one of his experiments, he combined a rat and a dog in a vat with FEIV, and as a result, he received a biological chimera.
Cat dog, alone in the world was a little cat dog.
The mutant had more advanced qualities for survival. The result of the experiment inspired Richard so much that he formulated a philosophy about the connection and unification of various beings in a harmonious unity, where he was the instrument by which unity was achieved. Having placed himself much higher than an ordinary person, Richard, by the end of November 2102, laid the foundations of unity and the dominant race, super mutants, which should be created from ordinary people. From that moment on, Richard Gray called himself the Master.
Nobody's master, got it? I don't want you here, and I don't want you here. I'm stuck with you.
The Master's main goals were the progress and healing of humanity through the creation of super mutants, which, in his opinion, were best adapted to life in a world after nuclear war. Considering all the people's shortcomings, the Master wanted to eradicate discriminatory and aggressive tendencies that could lead to another global nuclear war, and he practically forced people to evolve. He wanted super mutants to be not only strong and resilient, but also smart, like himself. In fact, he wanted all creatures on Earth to be like him. Therefore, he soon began to absorb people who accidentally wandered into Mariposa. At first, they seemed disgusting to him due to their intellectual underdevelopment. But Gray ordered himself to become more acceptable to unity and continued his experiment. And besides, with the help of FEV, he brought his body to perfection, developing a neural interface, the ability to remotely connect to the computer networks of Mariposa. After some time of catching and bathing experimental people in vats of FEV, the Master managed to turn one of them into a super mutant. Having absorbed this super-developed organism, Richard experienced tremendous pleasure and saturation. Now there were already two personalities living in the scientist. The experiment was considered successful, and therefore Gray put that process on stream. He caught people, created super mutants, and attached them to his body. People, succumbing to the influence of FEV, forgot their previous life, and, on the Master's orders, went in search of other people. Over time, the Master formed a full-fledged army of super mutants. For many years, the disappearance of entire caravans was attributed to desert monsters, and people in the hub were inclined to believe that the Deathclaws were to blame. Still, 6 meters tall and teeth the size of a hand should say something. In fact, the caravans that were most bothered by super mutants were the Truckers, aka the Fargo Traders, a California trade organization. Over time, the Master decided that he and Unity were cramped within the walls of Mariposa, so he decided to move to the local cathedral. There was a shelter underneath, which the Master began to use, and to cover up his activities, he organized the religious cult, the Children of the Cathedral. With his help, the Master continued to sow the ideas of unity among people. The true goal of the cult, hidden under the guise of charity, was to attract a mass of new followers, most of whom eventually went on a pilgrimage to the center of the cathedral, where they were immersed in vats of FEV. For the inhabitants of the Wasteland, the cathedral was only a harmless haven for the children of the cathedral, who were trying to bring peace and love to the Wasteland. So, having settled in the dungeon of the cathedral, in 2152, the Master met Morpheus, a former ruthless and ferocious bandit, and now the leader of the cultists. Morpheus led sectarians who believed in the end of the world and the nuclear explosions of the Great War as a sacred flame. Yes, the children believed that the nuclear apocalypse was the cleansing of the planet. In their opinion, once upon a time, the sacred flame descended on Earth. light from heaven, put to death humanity mired in vices and selfishness. And when the murderous light swept over Los Angeles, the cathedral, a holy refuge for the human race, survived, and in its depths a healing darkness was born, the Master, the Dark God. Beautiful, don't you agree? From this moment on, there were more and more super mutants, and they began to increasingly raid shelters, where, in the Master's opinion, the best raw materials for creating new super mutants were located. After all, people in shelters were not exposed to radiation, and besides, they had nowhere to run. Let us remember that the main purpose of most shelters was cruel experiments on people, and the purpose of Vault 13 was to keep people inside without opening the doors to the surface for 200 years. However, unexpectedly, for the inhabitants of this shelter, on December 4th, 2161, the irreplaceable chip for filtering water in the shelter broke down. The shelter overseer was forced to gather all the young and healthy inhabitants and find among them the one who would come out to the surface in search of a new water chip. This is where the game itself begins. Having cast lots, fate pointed to the Vault Dweller, and although history is silent about his real name, it is the Vault Dweller who is its main protagonist.
Today is the first day of the rest of your life. What are you doing? This is the first day of the rest of your life, but what kind of life will it be, huh?
The Overseer, who is secretly the director of the experiment in Vault 13, allows the doors to the surface to be opened for a minute and releases the Dweller. He doesn't know where exactly he should go. Everything is new to him. Mutated animals, ghouls, and people who have lost their human qualities. Gradually, the Dweller reaches Shady Sands, but he can't find the water chip there. Instead, he meets 16-year-old adventurer Tandy and a local guard, Ian. The Dweller helps them deal with the raiders from Khan's gang that have been annoying the residents of Shady Sands, and thereby provides the settlement with an invaluable service. Then, in search of the chip, the Dweller moves towards Junktown, killing raiders and mutants along the way. It is in Junktown that the Dweller meets his faithful partner, Dogmeat. The dog belonged to a certain traveler in a leather jacket with a strange accent. The previous owner had a falling out about a month ago with a local crime boss named Gizmo, who owns a casino and other businesses. As a result, Gizmo gave orders to kill him. Now Dogmeat sits near the house and waits for its owner. And if the Dweller feeds him with an iguana kebab on a stick, or puts on a leather jacket, then the dog will take him for the owner and follow him. Continuing his journey, the Dweller comes to the hub, where he negotiates with the water merchants to supply water to Vault 13 in order to delay the moment of complete depletion of water supplies in the vault. After this, he continues his search for the water chip, and, lo and behold, finds him in the Necropolis, a city founded on the ruins of the pre-war city of Bakersfield, by the descendants of the survivors and inhabitants of Vault 12. Actually, this shelter is located under the Necropolis, and the experiment that is carried out in it is to study the effect of radiation on local residents. The doors to Vault 12 are never closed. The Dweller finds out that radiation adversely affects people, and now Vault 12 is inhabited by ghouls. Moreover, some of them are so irradiated that they even glow and serve as lamps in the room. It turns out that the ghouls themselves have a broken water pump, but there is a chip in the walls of the vault that supplies water, so they use it. The Dweller is faced with a choice. Simply take the water chip from them, thereby leaving the ghouls to die from dehydration, or repair their pump and take the chip. Having dealt with this problem, the Dweller returns to his native vault, hands over the water chip to the Overseer, and tells about everything that is happening above. This seems to be the end. Everyone is saved. But no. After listening to the Dweller, the Overseer is very concerned that some people now know about the vault location. Allegedly, this could lead to an attack on him by super mutants. Therefore, the leader gives the Dweller a new assignment: to find and destroy the base of super mutants and their leader. Having left the vault again, the Dweller returns to the hub, where he tries to find out at least something about his opponent. By coincidence, he meets Jonathan, also known as the Missing Brotherhood Initiate. Jonathan is one of the members of the paramilitary organization Brotherhood of Steel. While carrying out a mission for the Brotherhood, he was captured by Decker, the leader of the Hub criminal group. But thanks to the Dweller, he is saved and now must report to management about what happened. the Dweller decides not to waste the opportunity and asks to join the Brotherhood. Together, they visit the Brotherhood of Steel base, Lost Hills, where the Dweller is on a mission to join the organization. As a result, he receives a powerful weapon, power armor, as well as access to many data. Among other things, he learns about the burying ground, where the super mutant base may be located, so he decides to head there. Along the way, the Dweller passes the necropolis and notices that its inhabitants have already been killed by super mutants. Having reached the burying ground, the Dweller learns that in the cathedral of the religious cult, the Children of the Cathedral, there is a secret bunker, and according to rumors, it is the refuge of a certain Master, a deity whom the cult worships and super mutants serve. Now the main character has to decide how exactly to deal with the Master and his henchmen, so to speak. Alternatively, the Dweller can enter Mariposa and blow up the base through its self-destruct protocol. Having launched the self-destruct protocol, the Dweller must go to the cathedral and simply kill the Master. Having done this, the self-destruct protocol is also triggered in the cathedral, and it blows up. If the Master is not killed directly, then he will simply die himself when the military base self-destructs. But there is a third option for eliminating the enemy, and it is perhaps the most interesting one. The Dweller can refer to the Brotherhood of Steel and scientists in a conversation to convince the Master of the infertility of super mutants, which is true. In this case, the Master's plan is doomed to failure, since by turning all people into super mutants, he will stop the development of humanity. No one will be able to continue the race, and over time, everyone will die out.
Cannot be. This would mean that
all my work
has been for nothing. Everything that I've tried to a failure. It can't be.
As a result of this dialogue, the Master triggers the self-destruction mechanism of the cathedral, and the Dweller's task is considered completed. With a clear conscience, he leaves the building before the explosion and returns to Vault 13. However, he again has no reason to be happy. The Vault Overseer listens to the Dweller at the vault door and thanks him for his work, but does not let him back inside. According to him, when the Dweller returns home, the inhabitants will be greatly inspired by his heroism and will want to come out too. They will begin to abuse the security in the vault and put everyone at risk. But this cannot be allowed. The doors must always be closed. Therefore, the Dweller, who has already saved Vault 13 twice, is forever expelled from its walls and forced to continue his life in the Wasteland. Fortunately, the Dweller manages to find soulmates without any problems and establish his own settlement on the west coast of the USA, Arroyo. But we'll tell you about this and what awaited the character in the second part another time. And now, it's time to talk about what didn't make it into the game. Immerse yourself in its inner atmosphere, amazing gameplay, and remember what players encountered when getting into the cruel world of Fallout. Fallout is a role-playing video game, so the player's adventures begin with the awareness of their own self. In simple words, choosing a character. Creating the appearance of your character, unfortunately at the time the game was released, was something out of the realm of science fiction. You will say, but Fallout is science fiction, and you'll be right. But no, it was impossible to edit a character's appearance in the first Fallout. The player was given 3 images of the hero to choose from, and 1 option with the ability to independently customize attributes. For example, among the offered images, Max Stone was strong and resilient, but did not have high intelligence. The granddaughter of a Russian diplomat, Natalia was a very smart, inventive, and cunning thief. And Albert was charismatic, cunning, and simply an excellent negotiator. But of course, it's always more interesting to try to create a character yourself. So, meet the special system. In the Fallout series, it's with us forever.
Like a day or so, the special system wasn't called special.
Yeah, it was called A-Slips. And then Jason Swin came in and he goes, "You could rearrange that." And he did it on my whiteboard. I'm like, I don't know, I like A-Slips. It's kind of like...
In fact, this is an abbreviation consisting of the first letters of the character's main characteristics. In the game, the character has only 7 basic characteristics that the player can customize: strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. And the range of their improvement varies from 1 to 9, but only on the condition that the sum of all attributes does not exceed 40. That is, it is impossible to get all the characteristics to the maximum. In addition, the player must choose for his character 2 characteristics that are especially important in the game: skills and traits. In total, the game offers 18 skills, from weapon ownership to medicine and repair, and the effectiveness of their use is determined by a percentage. Initially, the player can increase the effectiveness of the 3 skills by 20% at their discretion. In this case, for example, eloquence does not directly depend on charisma points, and even with a low charisma score, a character can be a good negotiator with outstanding eloquence, and vice versa. As for character traits, they can be both positive and negative, complicating the character's life in the Wasteland. The Dweller may have an accelerated metabolism, which will make him more susceptible to poisons and radiation, but the body's recovery process will be much faster. Being a hooligan, the Dweller will have greater punching power and strength, but will sacrifice speed and the total number of action points. I didn't know that the hooligan hits rarely, but accurately. I thought often and loosely. A miniature character has increased speed and agility, but can carry fewer things with them. A one-armed character copes excellently with one-handed weapons, but for some reason, not so much with two-handed ones. An accurate Dweller will be more accurate and have a high chance of a critical hit, but their damage will be less. The Kamikaze Dweller acts much faster in battle, and with a heavy hand, the character will hit hard, causing additional damage, although not always to the target. If the player wants to use a weapon in battle before the enemy, they must shoot offhand. Using a weapon costs 1 action point less, but the character will not have time to aim. And this is only half of all character traits available to the player. A bloodbath will ensure a brutal end for all of the character's opponents. The Jinxed trait will provide everyone around him, including the player character, with an increased chance of critical misses in battle. The Good-Natured trait guarantees the character high eloquence, bartering, and first aid, but a low level of combat skills. If a character is chem-reliant, he or she will recover from the after effects more easily, but may become addicted to illegal substances. The opposite of this character trait is the chem-resistant trait. Another interesting character trait may be the night person. With it, all the indicators of the Dweller automatically become better at night and worse during the day. The skilled trait will allow the player to have higher skills at the start of the game, but the character will acquire abilities less often. The last trait in the game is the Gifted trait, with which the character's characteristics at the beginning of the game are 1 point higher, but with each level, the player will receive 5 fewer skill points. And besides, the character's skills at the beginning of the game are pumped up 10% less. In general, it's logical. Some things are given from birth, but others need to be upgraded throughout life. And in fact, whether the player has a working build can be determined within the first 5 minutes of the game, since immediately upon exiting the shelter, the character encounters a flock of aggressive rats. The combat system in Fallout is simple, straightforward, and reminiscent of a turn-based tabletop RPG. The character has 2 hands, each of which can hold a weapon. Combat uses an action point system. No VATS, Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System. That is, the Vault-Tec Automated Targeting System, which allows the player to pause the game during battle, assess the tactical situation, and aim at certain parts of the enemy's body, was not yet available in the first part of the game. In the first Fallout, the player can perform several actions during a turn until he actually runs out of points. Different actions and weapons require different amounts of points, and the number of action points depends on the character's agility and skills. The player can quickly switch between 2 weapons, many of which are capable of hitting specific areas of the enemy and dealing different amounts of damage. Melee weapons usually have 2 attacks, a slash or a pierce. Automatic weapons can fire single shots or in bursts, and in addition, they require separate charging and reloading. The player also spends action points on this, as well as on character movements during battle. Anyone who has ever played Dungeons & Dragons or games with turn-based combat knows that it is advisable to do all the preparatory actions before entering the battle. If the player does not have a weapon in his hands at all, he can punch or kick, But the success of such an attack will of course depend on the character's characteristics, and the cave with rats that the player finds themselves in at the exit from the vault within first 5 minutes of the game is essentially a tutorial from the developers. And at the same time, it is also a test level for the player, whether his character can survive in such a world. If the level with rats turns out to be an overwhelming challenge for them, the player will probably face big problems on the surface, and it is better to recreate the character. Naturally, at the start of the game, the choice of weapons is very limited, and not to stray too far from the topic, let's immediately take a look at the weapons available in the game. Melee weapons also include fist weapons. The second includes rock, brass knuckles, and spiked knuckles, which deals 2 times more damage than a regular one. In addition, the player can find the Power Fist, which uses the energy of energy batteries to enhance attacks, and is the best weapon for hand-to-hand combat. The Power Fist deals up to 24 damage, but has only 25 charges in the magazine, after which it requires replacing a small battery. The battery can be bought from gunsmiths or taken from some super mutants. There is a wide range of melee weapons in the game: knife, combat knife, throwing knife, which is less effective in close combat, as it requires more interaction points than regular and combat knives. Naturally, a throwing knife is best thrown. Melee weapons also include a police baton and a crowbar, which can also be used to break into doors, lockers, and tables in the game. A fairly popular melee weapon in the Wasteland is the spear. People, ghouls, savages, hunters, guards, all are armed with spears in one way or another. But most of all, they are used by gangs of raiders. An interesting melee weapon for strong characters is the sledgehammer and super sledgehammer, which deals 4 times more damage. The peculiarity of this weapon is a critical hit and the ability to knock down an enemy, which sometimes leads to throwing the enemy a fairly long distance.
Next.
In addition, like fist weapons, melee weapons in the game are also represented by power ones. For example, a player can find a Ripper. It looks like a chainsaw, and thanks to the increased armor-piercing power, the Ripper can pin an enemy even in improved power armor. An excellent weapon for closed spaces, but as in the case of the Power Brass Knuckles, it has a magazine of 30 charges from a small battery. The second power melee weapon is the Electro Whip. The farmer's best friend model whip, to be precise, is a good weapon against enemies without a lightning rod. That is, with low resistance to electrical damage. A weapon that can paralyze an enemy and force him to skip moves. Quite accurate, but with only 20 charges in the magazine and running on a small battery. There are firearms in Fallout for every taste. The 10mm Colt 6.5, 2.0, and 44 Desert Eagle are fairly common and unremarkable. The 9mm Mauser and 14mm Sig Sauer have increased accuracy. And the most powerful among the pistols is the 0.223 caliber pistol, created from a sawed-off rifle. It has increased armor-piercing power and is found in a single copy in the game. The player can receive it from a refugee named Irwin by helping him clear the house from the Raiders gang. If the player wants to fire at enemies in bursts, the developers have added 3 automatic weapons to the game: H and KMP 9-10mm SMG, an AK-112 assault rifle, and a 12-round combat shotgun with the ability to fire bursts. There are 5 types of guns in the game: the regular hunting rifle, the rather weak Red Ryder BB gun, the improved version of the Red Ryder BB gun, also known as the exclusive Red Ryder LE BB gun, the powerful sniper rifle DKS 501 for long-range targets, and the Winchester shotgun, a typical sawed-off shotgun that fires buckshot and is effective at close range. Particularly interesting in the game are heavy and energy weapons. For fans of something heavier, the developers have added to the game the portable Rockwell CZ-53 personal minigun, which fires up to 6,000 rounds per minute. When firing, the minigun scatters bullets in a fan, and the angle of the spread depends on the player's heavy weapon skill. The larger it is, the more bullets are in the queue. At the same time, to effectively use a minigun, a character needs high luck, a high heavy weapon skill, as well as the abilities Sniper, Better Criticals, Action Boy, Action Girl, and the Fast Shot feature. Another heavy weapon is the Flambe 450 flamethrower. which has a shorter range but greater damage per shot, making it especially effective against groups of enemies. The final heavy weapon in the game is the Rockwell Big Bazooka. With critical hits, the bazooka knocks over the enemy and can force them to switch off for a long time, but the explosion can accidentally cover their allies. There are also more than enough energy weapons in the game. The Alien Blaster, Watt's 1000 laser pistol, and Glock 86 plasma pistol are energy pistols powered by small batteries. Laser gun, plasma rifle, and turbo plasma rifle are rifles powered by the energy of a nuclear microreactor. But the most interesting among the energy weapons is the Gatling laser, which also uses a nuclear microreactor and is the most powerful energy weapon. The game also has a Molotov cocktail, fragmentation, plasma, and pulse grenades, which set plastic explosives and dynamite as a trap. In a word, fight with whomever you want, how you want, and as much as you want. The character's movement on the map also happens step by step, and literally across the map. Since the first Fallout was isometric, the character's movement through the world was far from how many fans of the series may know it from the later 3D Fallouts. The process of moving from one point on the map to another took several in-game days, and was displayed by a moving red arrow on the minimap of the portable device. At the same time, the game geography covers most of California and a small part of Nevada. Part of this territory is indeed a wasteland, but in the game itself, the wasteland is elevated to the absolute level, and only occasionally does the player come across some locations. Most of the dweller's journey is fairly uneventful, but sometimes the game throws random events at the player that interrupt the movement of the arrow on the minimap and return the player to isometric space. Most often, this happens in connection with a random meeting of a character or group of creatures, and almost all the humor of the first Fallout is based on such random events and meetings. It's worth saying that because of this too, the developers limited the completion time for the player's first main quest to only 150 in-game days. Otherwise, the player would only wander back and forth in the Wasteland and look for adventures. Moreover, some characters encountered along the way can give the player side quests, for solving which they receive experience points. Therefore, if the player fails to complete the main mission within the allotted time, the entire game ends. The dialogue system in the game is quite interesting. We can say that here, the developers laid the foundations for the dialogue of the entire Fallout series, and, basically, influenced its development in other RPG games. The game characters vary in the amount of dialogue they have. Some speak in short messages, while others load the player with detailed information. Particularly significant characters during conversations are illustrated with 3D portraits, those same talking heads. You can not only take additional quests from these characters, but also find out information or trade. Nuka-Cola caps are used as currency in the game, although barter relationships can sometimes be found in the game. The player meets the first characters with whom you can interact in the settlement of Shady Sands. Among them is Tandy, the daughter of the local village leader and quest giver Aradesh, and Ian, who can become the character's companion. The player can hire companions to explore the area and fight, but they cannot be controlled directly. At the same time, the indicator of their karma and how others treat them will depend on how exactly the player communicates with the character and how exactly they solve this or that quest. Every second murder of a good creature reduces karma by 1, and every 6th murder of an evil one increases it by 1. Moreover, if the character eliminates at least one child, he will receive the title of Child Killer, which will make it more difficult for them to come to an agreement with many characters. Especially in the hub. The player can also receive the title Berserker for a large number of killed characters with positive karma, or the title Champion for killing characters with negative karma. Many quests have multiple solutions and can often be completed through diplomacy, combat, or stealth. Some even allow an unconventional solution that contradicts the original problem. And all this directly affects the development of the plot and the possible ending. The player can track all quests and other important information using the Pip-Boy 2000 personal laptop computer. The device is programmed to show how many days the water in the shelter will last, but in addition, it has a calendar and can record important dates and events. It's essentially a logbook. The player can see the missions by clicking the status button They are sorted by region and settlement. Uncompleted tasks are highlighted in green, and completed ones are crossed out. Below the status button, the player can notice a broken button. The inscription next to it has been erased, and wires are sticking out of the hole where the button used to be. In the game's demo version, this button was present and called Clues. It should have led to a screen with information for solving quests. However, in the release version of the game, this idea was abandoned, and in order not to completely redo the screen, the button was made inactive and given a similar appearance. Since we're on the topic of cut content, it's worth mentioning what didn't make it into the release version of the first Fallout. Considering the scale of the game world and the lack of any ideological boundaries among the developers, there was quite a lot of cut content. For example, in the same Shady Sands, originally according to Scott Campbell's plan, farmers should have had livestock that they could breed. It had to be a creature large enough to scare away most predators, fat enough to survive in the wasteland, and stupid enough to be domesticated. Yaks were on Scott's mind, but weren't post-apocalyptic enough, so Campbell came up with the idea of mutated gophers with long hair. Since farmers' lives depended on such animals, Scott admitted that they were considered almost saints in Shady Sands, hence the name Brahmin. In Hindu society, this is the name given to members of the upper caste. However, 4 months later, someone told Scott that his gophers were very similar to Banthas from Star Wars, after which Scott abandoned his version. Soon, someone on the team came up with the idea of two-headed cows, thanks to which Interplay was able to avoid a lawsuit from LucasArts.
It's not fair.
Another type of creature that did not make it to the final version of Fallout was the Salanter. The S-Lanter faction is briefly mentioned in the game itself and in the Fallout 0 Bible specially written for the game. However, more detailed information about them was first provided by Chris Avallone much later in the Fallout 7 Bible. According to legend, the Salanters appeared as a result of an experiment with one of the first strains of FEV carried out on January 12, 2076 on a group of raccoons at the West Tech Research Complex, later called GLOW. The experiment resulted in an increase in the size, intelligence, and agility of the raccoons. 2 pairs of creatures escaped from the complex, taking with them some equipment and documentation. Moving northwest, they came across a small oasis, where they settled in 2101. Initially, raccoons weren't hunters, but the effect of FEV undermined their instincts, and unexpectedly, the creatures became hunters. The development of intellect led them to the acquisition of reason and awareness of themselves as a separate people. In this regard, they chose the name Salanter for themselves, which translated as clan or relative. While the team was working on the quests and story of the sentient raccoons, the artists came to the conclusion that significant effort would be required to create raccoon models, several sets of armor and animation, while the Slanters themselves were very rare compared to other creatures. In addition to this, the resources of the art team were limited because they were already unable to cope with the amount of work that was necessary to implement all the planned content. As a result, the development team decided to cut the Salanter faction from the game to minimize work. In general, it is worth saying that many ideas were cut out at the development stage due to time and financial constraints. Locations, side quests, NPCs. The cut materials in the game files are enough for one more game. For example, when thinking through the concept of Fallout, Scott tried to encourage the developers to create event generation that would bring the world into a more dynamic state. Campbell put forward the idea of implementing an introductory walkthrough in the project instead of a video. However, due to the enormous amount of work performed by the programmers team, this idea was not realized. Scott also intended for Vault 13 to be the Dwellers' operational headquarters, where the player could return at any time. The Vault complex itself could have been attacked by raiders, and at a later time, it would have been attacked by super mutants. They were supposed to kidnap several people to Mariposa, and if the Dweller did not rush after them, then they would be turned into mutants, and then the chances of resisting them in the plot would be significantly reduced. In addition, the original demo of the game included quests with a detective component that could be solved using the method of deduction. But due to time restrictions and tasks simplification, complex deductive quests were abandoned. Subsequently, Scott Campbell, who was initially appointed to the position of lead designer, left the studio in 1997 in the midst of active work and was replaced by Chris Taylor. And then, the game continued to be refined and was soon released. However, there is another interesting point in the game's final version. Initially, it was planned to have one more melee weapon in Fallout. We are talking about an old knife with a straight blade, which holds noticeable traces of blood and rust. And the image of the old knife was present in the game files of the Fallout demo, but in the demo it was not possible to use melee weapons at all. That's why the knife itself was never included in the gameplay. An image of the old knife can still be found today in the Fallout game files, but the knife itself is not used in the gameplay, since there is no file with its characteristics. Basically, no matter how large the game may seem with all its secondary quests, dialogues, and locations, completing it won't be difficult and won't take hundreds of hours of free time. The main plot of the game can even be called Chamber. 150 days is enough for the player to complete the main task, even if the player slowly completes the secondary quests. But at the time of the first Fallout release, the player didn't even know about it, and, blinded by the timer, ran to look for a water chip, missing out on a bunch of interesting content. It is worth noting that in the game, there's sometimes a contradiction associated with the main idea of the Master. The player is constantly informed that the Master's long-term dream is to turn all of humanity into super mutants, thereby destroying all differences and contradictions between people, making them equal. Then wars on Earth will disappear. But sometimes the player is informed that super mutants are not the Master's ultimate goal, but only a temporary army and a supply of edible mass that he wants to absorb. And the Master's goal is actually to absorb all living organisms, including humans, super mutants, and everyone else, so that they live in him. And this point is not really cleared up anywhere. The only thing we know for sure is that the Master catches people and turns them into super mutants. And another contradiction is connected with this. The player may have a question. How did this mega brain, and simply a modern genius who knows absolutely everything, lose sight of such an important detail for the implementation of his plan as the lack of the ability for super mutants to reproduce? By the way, as for the game ending, yes, the developers provided alternative versions of it, which depended on the player's in-game actions. However, it's not so simple with them. You still need to try to get an alternative version of the ending. And the reason for this lies in the timer, or rather timers. Unobvious script launch timers that the player doesn't even see. For example, a player could destroy both the cathedral and Mariposa, but the final words would still say that the hub was destroyed.
The hub disperses before the might of the mutant army, and will never recover.
And the whole point is that as soon as the player moves to the stage with the Destroying the Master quest, a script is launched in the game and several timers are activated at once, one for saving each settlement. And the longer the player goes to the Master, the longer he destroys Mariposa and the Cathedral, the more settlements will be destroyed by the Master's army. And this affects the ending. At the same time, the player can kill the Master before they reach the military base, and thereby cancel the activation of all timers, and the Master's army does not even begin to attack the settlements. However, in order to try to kill the Master, the character requires level 18. There are 26 levels in total, but when completing most of the secondary quests, the player can get to a maximum level 14. To get the desired level, the player is forced to kill all possible monsters on his way, or wait for the death claws to respawn in the boneyard without killing their mother, which is essentially an abuse. It turns out that the game pushes the player into a strange order of completing the main quest, where the main villain dies first, and only then his army. But this is not mentioned anywhere in the game, so the player often chose the most obvious option, and, as a result, received a not-so-successful ending. But with all these shortcomings, and there is no other way to call them, the problems of the first Fallout are so insignificant, the game is simply beautiful. A concentrated post-apocalypse, after playing through which you already begin to miss its frightening setting, exciting tasks, charismatic characters, and non-boring gameplay. You want to plunge into radioactive madness again and again, play again and again until the charge of your home Pip-Boy runs out. But is this how the game was perceived on the day it was released? What was the public reaction to the first Fallout? And was the Dragonplay team able to secure a bright future for themselves? It's time to look at the release of the first part of the legendary Fallout series. But first, we would like to remind you, if you like what we do, you can support our work with your comment and subscription to our channel. We are already actively working on a new video for you, and we will be glad if you write us a couple of words in the comments so that this video can be seen by as many people as possible. Well, while our Mr. Handy puts all the suggestions and wishes into folders, we're moving on. If anyone thinks that the Fallout release went smoothly, like clockwork, and immediately made the game a worldwide success, then we hasten to disappoint you. The Fallout release was as chaotic as its development. Fallout didn't even have a trailer for its release. In fact, all of its advertising, for which Boyarsky and lead artist Jason D. Anderson were responsible, relied on a high-quality game demo, word of mouth, and beautiful packaging on the day of release. In total, the team created 6 different demo versions of Fallout at different stages of the game's development. All these demo versions consumed so much energy from the team that after the 5th version, Kane categorically refused to make demo versions for the marketing department. As an exception, he agreed to make the last one, which became a free and public demo version of Fallout. At the same time, for your understanding, the team had to make 3 builds for DOS, Windows, and Mac OS. And a week later, they also made versions with much reduced violence for access in countries with rating restrictions. This essentially caused the delay in the game release and the entire team's terrible crunch. A game demo was released on April 26, 1997, but Chris Taylor believed that the demo did not demonstrate the full essence of Fallout. It included one location, a town called Scrap Heap, which was a modified and significantly smaller version of Junktown. Having only Max Stone at their disposal, the player could click dialogues, complete easy quests, and could try to resolve the conflict between 2 gangs, the Crips and the Fools.
East side is the best. West side is the best.
And this not ideal demo, according to Kane, found its audience and really fueled interest in the future game. The game itself was released only 6 months later, in October 1997. The game's packaging resembled a lunchbox, and the manual was a survival guide to convey the atmosphere and style of the game. By the way, Fallout was not initially released in Europe, since in the release version the player had the opportunity to eliminate children. There was no way to get rid of age restrictions, so the developers had to remove all children from Fallout and release the game separately in Europe. It's also worth saying that the release version of Fallout had a huge number of bugs, which the developers tried to remove in version 1.1. It was released on November 13th, 1997, and most of the errors were corrected. Most, but not all. Some appear in the game to this day, although their solution can be found in the game files. Despite all this confusion, critics were incredibly happy with Fallout and considered it one of the best role-playing video games of that time. Some predicted that Fallout would revive the genre, arguing that the game would appeal to both casual gamers and RPG fans. The media called the game's setting fresh. They especially praised the character creation system, skill system, excellent plot, and cool presentation with a touch of satire. At the inaugural Interactive Achievement Awards, the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences nominated Fallout for Computer Entertainment Title of the Year, PC RPG of the Year, and Outstanding Achievement in Audio and Music. The Computer Game Developers Conference nominated Fallout for Best Adventure Role-Playing Game for its Spotlight Award. GameSpot nominated Fallout as Game of the Year, but the Nuclear Post-Apocalypse won in the Best Role-Playing Game and Best Ending categories. Just Adventure, an online portal specializing in adventure genre games, praised the visuals, sound, and ambient music, which created a believable atmosphere in the game. Perhaps it's easier to say what critics and publications responded negatively to Fallout was criticized for its unrealistic combat system and a poorly implemented satellite system that the player could not directly control. According to gaming publications, the combat was great when the player acted without partners, and disappointing when he was with them.
Wholesome. And these are my teammates. Literal trash.
Fallout was a commercial success. Of course, not as colossal as other role-playing video games, such as Baldur's Gate and Diablo. Fallout did not live up to Interplay's sales expectations. But the game gained a large number of fans, and by December 1997, more than 100,000 copies had been sold worldwide. In 2017, the studio reported sales of 600,000 copies of the first part of the game. But after the release of the series adaptation of Fallout in 2024, sales of all games in the series jumped up sharply. How much the company ultimately earned is not known for certain, because the mood inside Interplay, even after the game's release, was far from festive. In the wake of the Fallout initial success, Interplay began preparatory work on the sequel design. However, the core development team, especially Kane, Anderson, and Boyarsky, felt that many design decisions were being made by Interplay without their consent, even decisions about who should work on the project. Because Fallout received little attention from Interplay during its development, the designers were given wide freedom to create the game the way they wanted. However, the situation began to change in the last months before the release. In an interview, Tim Kaine stated that he was dissatisfied with the way Interplay handled the Fallout development. People who didn't play the games and didn't like them made important decisions about the game marketing, its features, and the release date. As a result, Kaine, increasingly dissatisfied with the new work environment at Interplay, decided that he did not want to work on a sequel in July 1997, 3 months before the Fallout release. Before Thanksgiving that year, Tim told Fergus Urquhart of his plans to leave the company, fearing increased interference from various Interplay divisions in the game's work, which could limit his creative freedom. As a result, Kaine worked on Fallout 2 for several more months, serving as lead designer and producer. Boyarsky and Anderson wrote the game's main storyline. However, problems within the company remained. According to Kaine, the marketing and sales departments made counterproductive decisions without consulting him. His desire to become head of marketing was met with resistance from Fergus Urquhart, who regarded it as an infringement on his powers and responsibilities. Kaine spent too much time arguing with people, trying to protect the game from becoming a less successful product. In mid-January 1998, he decided to leave Interplay. Boyarsky and Anderson did not want to work on the Fallout series without its main creator and their good friend, so the next day they quit too. After leaving Interplay, Kaine, Anderson, and Boyarsky met the next day to discuss their future plans. They did not plan to create their own company, since neither of them were businessmen, but they knew that they liked to work together, and it would be nice to find a job in some company. Yes, soon they joined the new company Troika Games, which later released the RPGs Arcanum, The Temple of Elemental Evil, and Vampire: The Masquerade – Bloodlines. The Dragonplay division, which developed Interplay role-playing games, was named Black Isle Studios in 1998. Developer Fergus Urquhart became its leader. The name Black Isle Studios was chosen in honor of the peninsula of the same name in Scotland, where Fergus was from. Interplay would soon face financial difficulties, and the future of Black Isle Studios would become uncertain. This would prompt Urquhart and several other industry veterans to leave the studio. In 2003, he created the company Obsidian Entertainment, where he took the post of head of the company. But we'll tell you all about this in detail in the next video dedicated to the ups and downs of the Fallout series. If you are interested in the history of another nuclear post-apocalypse, we recommend watching our video dedicated to the iconic Stalker. In it, you'll find out how many times the developers have postponed the game release, which ending of the game is considered canonical, and what is the secret of the name of the GSC Game World studio. Click on the video that has appeared on your screen, or you can select another video on this channel that you haven't seen yet. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like it and leave a comment. You are watching PressX. See you in new videos.